Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight for a conversation with Dr. Bruce Martin that I've really been looking forward to. It's so great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So welcome again. I'd like to take a moment to share with you about a place that I'm grateful to think of as my home away from home, as so many others do, International House Ann Arbor, or IHAA. IHAA is a living, learning residential community that hosts students, scholars, and faculty members from all over the world, including right here in the United States. The Global Engagement for Understanding program, which brings events such as this to the community, has the goal of enriching our global understanding through providing many different opportunities for intercultural engagement. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. Dr. Bruce Martin will present information and we'll have a Q&A session at the end, so you can jot down any questions that come to mind, or you're welcome to post them in the chat and we can ask at the end. We'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Bruce Martin, who will be introducing himself tonight.
Whenever the Ojibwe people gather for such teaching events, there's always a small ceremony involved. And I've never done a virtual smudging before, but I'm going to try to do that now. So you see here, I have my smudge container and a bit of sage. I have lit one leaf so that I don't set off the smoke alarms, but there's a little bit of sage from one of the sacred medicines here, and we'll just smudge the screen as we get started. So my first virtual smudge. It's good to see all of you. As we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the original Ojibwe people of Michigamme, or Michigan, which means great waters in the Odawa dialect. These lands that we now meet on and use every day were stolen under extreme duress by the US in the 1807 Treaty of Detroit, when William Hull was the governor of Michigan Territory. It's the custom in Ojibwe culture for speakers to introduce themselves, which is why Janelle didn't do that. So, and I should say that those introductions can be very long in the culture. We won't take that much time. I'll just say a few things about my background, in addition to the fact that I'm the executive director here at the International House Ann Arbor. For the past 20 years, I've developed and continue to teach in a program, small program at Penn State University, where I teach Indigenous Ways of Knowing in the Great Lakes region and Indigenous Ways of Knowing specifically among the Ojibwe people. My we'e in Ojibwe country was Gegowaabomin-minowaa, who's from the Nijigunsiminikaaning First Nations near Fort Francis, Ontario. We'e in Ojibwe means a spiritual mentor or teacher. And he's also the one who gave me my name. Image one, if you would, Janelle. And I'll give you a picture of my we'e. A very important person in the culture, and someone whom I have great respect for. And then you can move on to image two, Janelle. I want to say that I'm not Anishinaabeg or Ojibwe. My father is German Swiss and my mother German Irish. I don't speak for the Ojibwe people. I can only share what I've been taught and what I've learned, hopefully what I've learned from many elders and teachers over the years along that Minnesota-Ontario border. It's a beautiful part of the country. And many of you, or some of you, may know it as the Boundary Canoe Waters area. or the Quetico, and it's quite remote. If you look there at the purple region, that's generally the area that we're referring to as Ojibwe country today. So I want to get going on the journey with you. There are two sacred Anishinaabeg stories, the creation, recreation story and the Great Migration story. These are referred to as the Tissukanak stories. They're generally only told when there's snow on the ground, but I'm going to follow the Great Migration with you tonight and then try to say a few things about my own journey to Ojibwe country. One word before we go on with the journey about the creation is that there are 7 grandfather teachings or sacred teachings that are given to the Anishinaabeg people at creation and given in particular to human beings. And those teachings are there. And by the way, there are teachings around each one of these, but obviously we don't have time for that tonight. Love, respect, honesty, bravery, humility, truth, and wisdom. These form the foundation, not only of the culture, but a worldview. And I just want to make a comment about worldview as we, before we go on. Worldview is embedded in language and culture. Always has been, always will be. We're all swaddled in the cradle of a culture. And so I want to say something briefly about what culture is for me, or what worldview, I should say, is for me. I use worldview to refer to a system of beliefs or understandings that are interconnected in something like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. A worldview is not merely a collection of separate, independent, unrelated beliefs, but is instead an intertwined, interrelated, interconnected, internally coherent system of beliefs and practices. Navigating 3 cultures as a boy forced me to ponder cultural differences and adaptations, particularly how they impacted my own life. I was especially interested in knowledge and knowing. And I began over time to categorize Ojibwe ways of knowing as, and you can put up image 4, knowing as the as local, relational, empirical, spiritual, and traditional knowing. Go to the next slide. There we go. I discovered that deep, sustained cross-cultural encounters change who we are and change how we view the world. And as I've developed my program and courses at Penn State, I focus with my students on these 5 aspects or tenets of knowledge. Let's go back to image 3. There we go. And so we'll begin now the Great Migration and attempt to answer the question of how Ojibwe people came to our region.
Pandemic in the White House because it's a very small area.
Tragedy occurred in the years roughly 950 to 1000 CE, or the Common Era. The Anishinaabeg people, consisting of many clans and villages, lived and flourished around the mouth of the St. Lawrence River along the Atlantic coast. And they were neighbors to the Beothuk people. More than 500 years before Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, bringing to this part of the world a reign of terror and genocide, which essentially exterminated the Taino people. The Vikings arrived in what is today called Newfoundland and set up a permanent establishment in a place called Vinland. That permanent settlement is a place you can visit today. So we know for sure that they established a permanent settlement, permanent at least for about 10 years. And then for 400 years following, they continued to frequent the Atlantic coast, particularly in the region of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And with them, they brought war and disease and exploitation of Beothuk people lands as well as Anishinaabeg lands. This tragedy and encounter 500 years before Columbus came to this part of the world may never be fully known. The grandfathers or the spiritual elders gathered to pray and listen for instructions from the Creator. And in Ojibwe culture, the Creator is known as Kichi-Menetu, which simply means uncreated creator or uncreated spirit. Spirit is central to the Ojibwe worldview, and that's why I begin there. What is really real, enduring, is spirit, not matter. Matter is fleeting, spirit is enduring. So spiritual knowledge or knowing is what Joseph Brown refers to as the metaphysics of nature. In the Ojibwe worldview, if you want to know the Creator, you draw close to nature. Yeah, that's putting it pretty simply, but I don't have time to get into the complications of these particular ideas or concepts. But this journey, this migration was initiated and began by tragedy and the need for survival and careful listening to the voices of the prophets. Ojibwe people had prophets and continue to have prophets. Image 5. In a dream, the MIIGIS shell rises from the Atlantic Ocean, the sea, and speaks to one of the spiritual leaders, probably a Mi'kmaq elder. And by the way, the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki people and many others are part of today what's known as the Wabanaki, and they are known as the Keepers of the Eastern Door. They remained on the East Coast, in Maine and in the Maritime provinces. And this vision or dream instructed the Ojibwe people to depart their eastern lands, to escape seen and unseen enemies, to move to a Turtle Island location where food grows on water. A place of survival and abundance. And this was the first prophecy, and there were 6 more on this journey. At the same time that they were being ravaged by disease, introduced by contact with the Vikings or from the Vikings, the Medewin, which means the Great or Grand Medicine Society. It's really the central spiritual core of Ojibwe spirituality, even today, was revitalized. The great migration journey occurred gradually but steadily over approximately 500 to 600 years. Without GPS, they began to move west on the interstate, well, on the St. Lawrence River, which was the interstate of that time. And the first prophecy was for them to stop at a turtle-shaped island, which is near Montreal on the river. The second one was Niagara Falls. Then third was Detroit, the Detroit River, probably Lake St. Clair. And then to Manitoulin Island. Then to Sault Ste. Marie, that's number 5. And then to Duluth, Minnesota. And then to Madeline Island, a group of small islands in Lake Superior, today referred to as the Apostle Islands. Ojibwe spiritual leaders also look to the eighth fire. And let me make a comment here about why these prophecies are sometimes referred to as fires. And I'll connect it to the Three Fires Confederacy here in a moment. They're referred to as fires because they refer to places, gathering places, locations that became places of survival and sustenance for the Ojibwe people throughout this long journey. Fire means a gathering place. It's where you gather in those communities to learn, to support each other and so forth. These were semi-nomadic people. And during these long winters that they were familiar with, they would scatter about in small family groups, but would gather again to these major gathering places during the warmer months to enjoy each other's company as a people and to grow crops together and so forth. So these are called fires because they're gathering places that sustain the people in this journey. First European contact with Ojibwe people occurred, as far as we know, probably at the Mackinac Straits, maybe down along the western edge of Lake Michigan. The French were the first to arrive. Champlain arrived, as you know. The Jesuits followed and established camps and moved into the villages along the way. And then there were the Beaver Wars and so forth. Tonight we won't get into all of that history, but contact occurs at that time, and they begin to influence the Ojibwe in many different ways through the furnishing of guns and gunpowder and all kinds of things, because war and hostility occurred throughout the entire journey, primarily with the Iroquois-speaking people to the east, now in what we refer to as the Six Nations in New York and Quebec, and then also with the Dakota people who they faced as they moved westward. You may not know that the Dakota people were actually woodland people who were then forced out onto the plains, and we know them as plains people, as the Ojibwe moved in to the Great Lakes region, empowered by their French allies. So they allied with the French until the British defeated the French, and they allied with the British until the British were defeated by the Americans. And from then on, there was trouble, because in the view of the Ojibwe people, the Americans were intent on their extermination. The first land cession, the ceding of land, occurred in 1795, the Treaty of Grenville, which included a portion of Michigan and Ohio. And then the second one was the Detroit Treaty, which I mentioned, which occurred in 1805, 1805, I believe. So by the 1700s, the Ojibwe had spread west into northern Minnesota and northwestern Ontario. They had completed their great migration following the MIIGIS shell, which at every location or every fire rose from the water with the prophecy. Go on to, yes, there you are. Sorry. Yeah, that's good. So you see that little red corner up there in the corner of that blue spot in northern Minnesota? That's home for me. So their prophets said simply to move or perish, and move to where food grows on water. That was the objective or goal of their migration. Now I want to shift to my own personal journey and migration. My journey to Lake of the Woods. So here we are with this image 6 map of Minnesota. And so if you look along the northern edge of Minnesota, there's a river that separates us from Canada. It's called the Rainy River. The Ojibwe people made their way from Grand Portage on Lake Superior up the Rainy River into Lake of the Woods, which is where I encountered the Ojibwe people and food growing on water. Tragedy struck for me and my family in the 1960s, a tragic death, which I won't go into, but my parents made a decision to move move with 8 of their 14 children from northern Wisconsin to the remote, in fact, the most remote region in the lower 48 at the time, known as the Northwest Angle. And that's the region I pointed out to you up there. Image 7. The landscape for me took on new meaning and importance. I had moved from farm country in Wisconsin, pastures, cattle, fields of grain, rolling hills, and hardwood forests, what there were left of them, to vast peat bogs, lakes, large and small, a lowering sky, dark spruce and wispy tamarack forests of northern Minnesota. It was a different place. All was wet, strange and unfamiliar. For the first time, I became deeply aware of the land, its feel, textures, colors, smells, and in many other ways. I think sometimes we're so disconnected from land and place today that we don't associate these many senses with a sense of place. But I became very aware of it through this migration of my own. My senses were awakened. I became aware of Mother Earth, or Aki. Aki is Mother Earth in Ojibwe, as a living presence in ways I hadn't before. When you're farming or tilling the soil, you're making it do what you need it and want it to do. But my experience in Ojibwe country was quite different, very different, in fact. I became aware very quickly that the land and the place was a character in my own story, in my own sense of identity, in ways I hadn't before. I began to sense the importance of land and place, or what people today call local knowledge, and its impact on culture and personal identity. Image 8. We arrived at Pine Creek in the quiet of winter. Several feet of snow, 20 degrees below zero. What a time to migrate, hey? Towed behind a massive log loader across frozen muskeg, snow, and rutted logging trails. My mother must have been beside herself. We arrived at a 2-room log cabin built before Sitting Bull. Next image. Before Sitting Bull fled into Canada in 1877. No electricity, no modern conveniences of any kind. It sat akimbo on the mouth of Pine Creek, like it was about to cave in at any moment. Angle Inlet, Northwest Angle, Lake of the Woods, accessible only by going into Manitoba and coming in from behind, other than traveling by boat across those large bodies of water. I found myself in land surrounded by Ojibwe families, culture, and ways of life. The closest town was Kenora, Ontario, 45 miles north. It may as well have been 400 miles. And Warroad, Minnesota, you can see it there on that little map, about 80 to 90 miles to the south. totally inaccessible except by ferry boat on rare occasions. I began immediately almost the 2.25-mile walk in ice and snow to a one-room schoolhouse with 20 brown-skinned and raven-haired Ojibwe children speaking Ojibwe-Moan on the playground. Not long after arriving, my sister was born, and across the bay, probably 3 miles away, Arrowroot Blackhawk came to visit. She came to see the new baby. She embodied the 7 grandfather teachings in relation to total strangers, intruders, really. She and Elder John began teaching me simple and basic lessons of survival, that we are all related, interconnected, dependent, that all of our knowledge and knowing is relational. And she showed us the meaning of, in that moment, the meaning of Jawenim, that is unconditional love for a complete stranger. She took my little sister, an infant at that time, held her in her arms, spoke a few words in Ojibwe. She was 80 some years old. And she turned to my mother and she said, "Wow, Mrs. Martin," she couldn't speak a lot of English. She said, "Wow, Mrs. Martin, a whole nother tribe." Remembering there were quite a few children in that little cabin. Very quickly, I became aware of a contrast in values. I observed and felt the pain of racism and injustice. Trips to Flag Island, the Blue-Eyed Chief, which was nothing more than a wilderness pawn shop, where desperate families pawned their canoes, their motors, and chainsaws to buy supplies for hungry children. An entire summer resort had been built for wealthy tourists by cheating hardworking Ojibwe people who fished, hunted, and harvested to survive. Survival meant resisting racial and systemic injustice, a choice that as a young boy shaped my life deeply and permanently. And then there was little Charlie Wenjack, who died on the railroad track. And I learned about it in school. And I wondered what happens when little children go to school. Could that happen to me? Image 10. Survival meant learning the skills of trapping, fishing through ice, hunting game, and stretching skins. I was soon carrying a long rifle wherever I traveled. In spring, our garden was planted and enough for the entire community. At summer fishing camps, bundled Ojibwe babies were carried on strong backs or propped up in dickenoggins while parents worked, sang, and spoke to each other. Anishinaabeg. Anishinaabeg. Survival meant allowing the earth to teach me to awaken my 5 senses to nature and all living spirits, including the elders. And I sat for many hours with John and Arrowroot Blackhawk across the bay. The natural world became my science classroom, and I was part of it. I was in it. I had questions. I began researching, developing hypotheses, conducting experiments, observing carefully, and starting the whole process over again. My mother tells me I recorded notes and wrote Ojibwe words in my notepad, which I literally carried with me. Empirical knowledge, you see, became crucial to survival and identity. Image 11. Those are the dickenoggins. 12. There we go. In late August and early September of that very first year, what's known as rising moon, I stood at the water's edge watching the sky, the currents, the wind, the ducks and the cormorants, listening to the whispering grass. I pulled my canoe through the grass and returned without food. Friends smiled, watched and waited, made a few jokes. Finally invited, I climbed into my neighbor's canoe, knockers in hand. He pulled quietly through the sea of grass, birds singing, the sun hot, the fresh grain slowly filling the canoe, food in abundance for the coming quiet of storytelling winter. Don't take it all. Leave some for the birds. Put some of that back in the water, I was told over and over again. And then the drying, the parching, learning to dance, it's called hulling, learning to dance on the wild rice, winnowing and storing, the sounds of the drums, children playing, parents laughing. That first fall harvest taught me to wait and watch for the right moment to gather wild rice. We came to land with a canoe loaded to the gunwales with sacred food. My understanding of the connection between survival and traditional knowledge deepened. Listen to the elders. Follow in their footsteps. It isn't that change can't occur, but disaster may strike if you don't. You come back without any food. Seasonal fall ricing camps, like summer fishing camps, were favorite times for me, and they were deeply educational. Wild rice, known as Zizania palustris, food growing on water is more than survival for Ojibwe people. It's an abundant resource, gives life and health to the people. It's 11% protein, 80% carbohydrates, and 1% fat. So much better than processed meats, white bread and Twinkies, sugary drinks. Manoomin then and today is sacred to the Ojibwe people. Ojibwe culture and identity are tied to this plant in so many ways. Harvesting wild rice is a family affair. It's a community event, a seasonal activity, which reminds us of the goodness and blessing of Kichimanatu, the creator. Not until rising moon did I begin to understand the 7 prophecies and the meaning of the migration as told by the spiritual elders, move or perish to where food grows on water, which was also the promise and hope of the 8th prophecy. And that prophecy, that hope remains today, a hope for the future of the people, and not only for Ojibwe people, but for the relationships between all Native people, Indigenous people, and the visitors known as European Americans. Thank you for listening. Next slide. Back one. There we go. In Ojibwe, we say when we're leaving. No, back one more. No, the other way. There we go. Gegowaabomin-minowaa. That's we'll see you in the future. There's no real goodbye in Ojibwe. And so please ask me any questions you like.